I didn't notice when my children started staying only a short while when they visited. I only noticed when I began looking at the clock before they had even finished their tea. It wasn't something they said. It was something I felt quietly, the way you feel the evening arrive before the light actually disappears. There was a time when their visits filled the whole day without anyone planning it that way. Back then, they didn't come. For a little while. They just came. They walked in like the house still belonged to them, which in many ways it did. The door would open, voices would move through the hallway, and suddenly the kitchen would feel smaller and warmer and somehow more alive. Someone would open the refrigerator without asking. Someone would sit at the table while I made coffee. Someone would say, "What are we doing later?" even though no one had planned anything yet. Those visits never felt like visits. They felt like the day unfolding the way it always had. When they were younger, the house had a different rhythm altogether. Shoes by the door. Jackets on chairs. School bags leaning against walls. Even the quiet evenings had a certain fullness to them, the kind that comes from knowing someone else is in the next room doing something ordinary. I remember one winter afternoon especially clearly. The snow had come early that year. The driveway was half covered before I had finished clearing the first path. One of them stood at the kitchen window watching me, tapping on the glass and laughing because I kept pretending not to notice. Later we all sat at the table together drinking hot tea, still wearing our sweaters, talking about nothing important at all. I thought evenings like that would always feel close enough to return to if I needed them. Even after they grew older and moved into their own homes, they still came often. Not always together. Sometimes one at a time. Sometimes unexpectedly. Sometimes just long enough to sit at the table and talk about work, or neighbors, or something they had seen on the way over. But they stayed. That was the difference. They stayed long enough for the visit to feel like part of the day instead of something that fit between other plans. I didn't notice right away when that changed. The first sign was so small it barely seemed like a sign at all. One evening they came by after work. I had just finished making soup. The kitchen still smelled like onions and pepper and warm bread. They sat down, just like always. We talked. We laughed about something I don't even remember now. Then one of them looked at the clock. Not in a hurry. Not impatiently. Just automatically. "We can stay a little while," they said. I remember that sentence because it was new. Before that, nobody had ever said how long they could stay. After that evening, I started hearing that sentence more often. "We can't stay too long. We only stopped by for a minute. We have to leave soon." Each time it sounded reasonable. Normal. Adult lives are full. I understood that better than anyone. I had spent years hoping they would grow into lives that were busy and independent and steady. Still, something about those visits began to feel different. Not worse. Just shorter in a way that was hard to explain. One Sunday afternoon they came together. That used to happen often. I made coffee. Someone brought pastries. We sat at the table the way we always had. For a little while everything felt exactly the same. Then someone checked their phone. Another said they had somewhere else to be later. Someone else said traffic would get worse if they waited too long. And before I quite realized what was happening, chairs were moving back, cups were being rinsed in the sink, jackets were being picked up from the backs of chairs. The house became quiet again faster than I expected. I stood in the kitchen after they left and looked at the table for a moment longer than usual. 3 cups instead of 1. But still less time than before. At first I told myself it didn't matter. People grow. People build their own routines. People move forward. That is what parents hope for. But after that afternoon I began noticing something I hadn't noticed before. I started preparing for visits differently. Not intentionally. Just quietly. If they said they might stop by, I found myself watching the clock a little. Not because I was worried they wouldn't come, but because I already knew they might not stay long once they did. Sometimes they stood in the kitchen instead of sitting down right away. Sometimes they stayed near the doorway while we talked. Sometimes they kept their coats on longer than they used to. Those are small things. But when you have lived with someone for years, small things are the language you understand best. One evening, one of them came alone after work. We sat at the table together like always. I made tea. We talked about the week. Then, halfway through the conversation, they said, "I can only stay a few minutes tonight." It wasn't said with distance. It wasn't said with apology. It was simply information. Still, after they left, the kitchen felt quieter than it had before. Not empty. Just quieter in a way that stayed with me longer than I expected. There was a time when visits stretched into evenings without anyone noticing. Someone would sit in the living room. Someone else would walk into the kitchen looking for something to eat. The television might be on, but nobody was really watching it. Now visits seemed to arrive with an ending already inside them. I didn't say anything about it. There wasn't anything to say. Nothing was wrong. They still came. They still called. They still asked how I was doing. But something about the shape of their time had changed. One afternoon I found myself setting 3 cups on the kitchen table before they arrived. Then I stopped and put one back in the cabinet. Not because they weren't coming. Because I didn't know how long they would stay. That surprised me. Not the action itself. The fact that I had begun thinking that way without realizing it. Later that week I walked past the hallway where the family photos hang. There's one picture there from years ago. All of us sitting around this same kitchen table. Someone laughing. Someone talking with their hands. Someone looking at the camera too early. That picture still looks like a day that never ended. I stood there for a while looking at it longer than I meant to. It wasn't sadness I felt exactly. It was recognition. Recognition that time had moved forward in ways I had not fully noticed while they were happening. The moment everything became clear came on a Saturday afternoon. They said they would come by together. I made coffee. I set out cups. I opened the window slightly the way I always do before guests arrive, even though they are not guests. They came in smiling, talking about something that had happened earlier in the day. For a little while everything felt familiar again. We sat at the table. We talked about ordinary things. Someone asked about the garden. Someone asked whether the neighbor had fixed his fence yet. Then one of them looked at the clock. "We should probably get going soon," they said. It was said kindly. Naturally. Without hesitation. Without discomfort. Just the way people speak when their lives continue beyond the room they are sitting in. I walked them to the door like I always do. We stood there for a moment before they left. They hugged me. They said they would come again soon. And I knew they meant it. But as the door closed behind them, I realized something clearly for the first time. They weren't staying long because their lives were somewhere else now. Not far away. Not separate. Just larger than this house. I stood in the kitchen for a while after that. The cups were still on the table. One chair was still slightly pulled out. The room looked the same. But something in the way I understood their visits had changed. I stopped expecting afternoons to stretch the way they used to. I stopped measuring visits by how long they lasted. Instead, I began noticing something else. The way they still came at all. The way they still asked about small things in the house. The way they still knew where everything was without looking. The way they still sat in the same chairs they always had. One evening not long after that, they came by again unexpectedly. No plans. No reason. Just a short visit on the way home. We sat at the kitchen table together. We talked. We laughed about something small. And when they stood to leave, one of them paused and said quietly, "I wish we could stay longer." That sentence stayed with me. Because it meant they had noticed the same change I had. And somehow that made the visits feel different again. Not shorter. Just more meaningful. My children don't stay long when they visit anymore. That is true. But they still come through the same door. They still sit at the same table. They still call this house home in ways that do not depend on how many hours they spend inside it. And maybe growing older means learning to understand that love isn't measured by how long someone stays. Sometimes it's measured by the fact that they still come at all.